the meeting.
All righty. Excuse me.
Okay, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Welcome to the Oxford City Council Finance and Governance Committee regularly scheduled meeting. The date is May 26th, 2020, and we'll have the city clerk take the roll, please.
Member Lopez?
Here.
Member Perello?
Hello?
Member Perello?
Here.
And Chair Flynn?
Present.
Chair, we have a quorum, and the agenda for this meeting was posted in the City Hall kiosk on Thursday, May 21st.
Thank you very much. All rise and for the Pledge of Allegiance, please. Place your right hand over your heart. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Be seated, please. Okay, the very first item on the agenda are public comments on items not on the agenda. Madam City Clerk, do we have any speaker cards for that item?
No.
Very well. We won't even read out the item then. We'll now go to item C, the consent agenda, and it's the minutes. What's the pleasure of the committee?
Move to approve.
Second.
Okay, Madam City Clerk, we have a motion by Committee Member Lopez and a second by Committee Member Perello. The vote, please.
Member Lopez?
Yes.
Member Perello?
Yes.
Chair Flynn?
Aye.
The motion to approve carries 3-0.
Thank you very much. We'll move now on to page 2 of the agenda, and that's under item D in reports. The very first item, number 1, Human Resources Department, the subject, city's response to internal audit overtime. Recommendation, excuse me, is that the Finance and Governance Committee receive the report and recommend to the City Council that they receive and file the city's response to Price Page and Company's overtime usage audit report presented to the committee on March 24th, 2020. Mr. Naveau.
I'm going to have Henry go ahead and start us off.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Good morning, Chair Flynn. Good morning, Committee Member Perello and Committee Member Lopez. Thank you. My name is Henry Ohm. I am with Price Page and Company. We serve as the internal auditors for the City of Oxnard. So I'm here to present with Steve Naveau from the Human Resource Department the overtime recommendations and the city's response to those recommendations. If everyone could remember, we issued our comprehensive overtime report back in early March, and I gave an overview of that report to the Finance and Governance Committee on March 24th. So we're here to go through the details of that recommendation, the recommendations that we made, and the city's response related to each one of them. Next slide, please. So again, we provided a number of recommendations, a total of 7, and here's the first one. And I want to provide some context because it has been a while for each of these recommendations. The first recommendation we have is it's a hire versus overtime analysis. So anytime you take a look at overtime and there's a significant amount expended in overtime, you always have to ask the question, why is overtime being utilized? Why is overtime being utilized? Overtime is a good mechanism to manage staff resources, temporary shortages. But if it's not monitored appropriately, it may inadvertently impact us financially. And so as a result of our analysis, we had one recommendation that says maybe the city should take a look at the hire versus overtime in the public service departments. We noted that a combination of police and fire had a total of about 76% of total overtime usage in the past 4 fiscal years that we reviewed, fiscal year 18, 17, 16, as well as 15. So that begs the question of what is overtime being utilized for and whether there's a shortage of staff. So our recommendation here to the city is to review the nature of the overtime usage and analyze perhaps not all positions, but the top positions. So what are the top 5 positions within fire and police that have the most overtime, and analyze whether there's any potential vacancies related to that. So the city has drafted a response, and I'll let Steve discuss that response.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. So I think it's important when you're looking at filling positions that we understand in public safety, it's not your typical recruitment. You know, typical recruitments, if it's not hard to fill, takes about 120 days to fill a position versus public safety, it can take upwards to 20 months. And that has to do, and that's going from when you first start a recruitment to, you know, you get people on board and you train them and they're actually now in the field soaking up, you know, what could be overtime usage. So I think that's the first thing that folks need to understand. So within this, you know, Henry talked about the two departments. So in the police department, the city is always working to hire replacement police officers. There's never a halt or a freeze on that. So there's not necessarily an analysis. I think that's required, at least on this. As far as the fire department goes, that is a department that they do hold vacancies until they reach an economy of scale. And there, I think it's important that folks understand that when the department does a fire academy, that is staffed with people in-house. So you're going to run additional overtime, which the department, again, they look out into the future to see when are we going to have, you know, 10 to 15 vacancies from people retiring, you know, leaving the organization, to then put all of our resources into actually running that recruitment and getting the academy up and going. So that would be our response on that.
Okay.
Next slide.
Next slide, please. This is the second recommendation that we have as a result of this overtime audit, and it's to consider and eliminate allowing unproductive time such as vacation and sick leave to be considered as time worked when calculating overtime. So when we started to dissect the overtime usage, we recognized that there were vacancies, as well as, you know, sick time off, vacation time off, and how that was all factoring into the overtime computation. Then we recognized that vacation and sick time was actually computed as a productive time. And what that means is an employee could potentially leave on, let's say, a 2-week vacation, come back, and if their hours are met, the next time they work would trigger overtime. So obviously when you're paying overtime, it's at a much higher rate than regular time. So we're saying here, the city should review the memorandums with each of the union groups to see if it's possible to amend those contracts or renegotiate those contracts to eliminate that. That would reduce the potential cost to the city in having sick time, vacation time being counted as productive time.
Yeah, so and in the city's response, we would agree with that. The MOU unproductive time, I mean, that is something that is specific to the MOUs. It's not a legal requirement. So for us to make that change, we will have to look to negotiate that out of the current contracts. I think it's next year the contracts are up for renegotiation. That'll be an item we'll have to look at that time.
Okay. Great. Next slide, please.
Excuse me, Mayor, may I ask a question? Mayor. Well, I'll ask you. Mr. Nagu.
Sorry about that.
Nagu, how much of the overtime, based on this description that Mr. Ohm has just given, did we find? Like, what percentage of our overtime? Insignificant single digits or double digits?
I would have to actually drill down into those numbers and look through payroll to try. Well, we're going to have to look at payroll and schedules with the departments to try and figure out how much of this time is potentially due to unproductive time. I mean, so that's going to take more research.
I appreciate the way Mr. Ohm has made the presentation here. That is like a no-brainer. That's common sense. You don't get overtime when you come back from vacation. But when it comes to the full council, I expect those numbers to be available, Mr. Nagu. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Okay. Next slide, please. This third recommendation is what we call highest and best use. In the private sector, you know, in our industry and our business, we always try to utilize personnel at their highest and best use. So even if a lower ranking staff person is able to function at a much higher level, we would utilize that staff. So that type of approach was brought into this analysis as well. So when we were reviewing various positions that were vacant, we're here recommending that the department should fill from a lower ranking position first if the employee is as qualified for that same ranking position. So for example, you know, I'll just make up some titles. Level 1 staff, level 2 staff. If a level 2 staff is out on vacation and the level 1 staff, which is a lower ranking position, is able and qualified to function at that level, you would utilize the resources of that lower level staff. That allows the lower level staff to gain experience at that higher functioning level, as well as the city is paying a lower level staff at a much different rate, a lower rate than a higher ranking staff. So I will have to acknowledge that, you know, this is a different approach. We take what is called a dollar and cents approach. We don't try and consider the political or cultural impact of this type of recommendation, because we understand that it is a significant shift from any potential current practices. So I wanted to clear that up, because again, we're focusing this recommendation from a dollar and cents perspective. And so that is what we're recommending, is that if there's an opportunity for someone at a lower ranking level to fill a vacancy at a higher ranking level, if they are qualified and able and competent and can fulfill those responsibilities, perhaps consider that.
So I have down that the city disagrees, but after, you know, Henry's explanation, I mean, I don't want to say the city outright disagrees with this, because what he's talking about is also building your bench strength. So giving employees opportunity to work in higher level positions. So when promotional opportunities come around, that is something that they can seriously be considered for. Right now, under our contracts, those that have this type of language in it, it does require us to fill from the same classification. And so that's what oftentimes will inhibit us. It's not in all of our contracts, and I know this is more focused on public safety, but throughout the city, if we were to make this change, we would have to go to our unions and we would have to negotiate that. But it is a good idea, what Henry's proposing here, to try and build that bench strength for our folks, so that they're more prepared to promote. So again, we disagree, but it's more, I think, disagreement because it's not something we could do immediately. It's something we would really have to work with the unions on. And like Henry said, we'd have to talk about, you know, the culture as well as the contracts and making changes to that.
Absolutely. And just to comment, you know, our recommendation is easy from our standpoint, right? And then now actually putting it into practice, renegotiating with the unions and getting all buy-in on something like that is challenging. There's no doubt about it. So it's easy just for us to make a recommendation, but we appreciate the city's response to that. But I just wanted to point that out as well, that it's not as easy as just saying, make the change, right? It takes much more effort than that. Okay. Next
comment.
Yes, go ahead, Councilman, Committee Member Payroll.
Henry, I really appreciate this. It sounds common sense, but again, we do have rules and contracts. And I will say, I want to make this statement. In the past, it appears that mid-management has often had the concerns that they've been working out of class. They've been working out of class, doing above class. And if they are not trained, if the human resources hasn't indicated that they're trained and qualified for the next class, but they're doing that work, it has raised a lot of issues. My understanding is that's one of the reasons that the mid-managers organized and became a union of themselves, because they were abused for so long under past leadership in the city. And I appreciate you bringing this up, but I expect my staff to carry this item and that information that I just stated in however manner they want to let the public know this, because there's a lot of misconceptions about overtime and the abuses of overtime in the city by residents. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. Compensatory time. So this is a fun one. When you think of overtime, most people think, okay, I'm working extra above my limits. Now I'm going to be paid at a higher rate. Well, one additional component of overtime is compensatory time. And this basically allows an employee to defer the overtime that's been worked. So for example, if I'm working an extra 10 hours this pay period, I can elect, based on different levels, I can elect to defer that overtime for a future period, to be paid out at a future period. We know that as banking time, right, where you defer it over to the next period. When we analyze that component of overtime, compensatory time, we know that there were about 15 employees in fiscal year 2018 that were over that limit, and all 15 employees were in the public safety departments. And so here what we're saying is maybe the city should adopt comp time limits that are more in line with the Fair Labor Standards Act, which has a maximum of 480 hours for comp time accruals. We noted that those 15 employees comprise of approximately 6,600 hours that have been banked over the years. And the impact of that, obviously, is When you bank your hours, in my example, if I bank my 10 hours to the next year, well, theoretically, I would be, in line for raises and promotions and pay increases and whatnot. That accrual will be subject to my new rate whenever I use it, whenever I bank that out or get it cashed out. So it inadvertently impacts the total cost of overtime when you allow a higher rate. So that's something that we noted as a part of our overtime audit.
And the city would agree with those maximum FLSA thresholds. Just real quick to kind of take everyone back in time when City Manager Nyhoff was here, this was an issue he had to deal with in that these comp time banks were well in excess of the legal limit. And for public safety, that's 480 hours. For non-safety, it's actually the non-safety has some limits in their contracts. It's like about 100 hours per fiscal year. So that is something that they made a huge change back when City Manager Nyhoff was here and did some secondary banks and things of that nature to clear that out. There's, I know going back and looking at it for a couple years back, like Henry has done, there were still a few that were over those caps. At this point, the caps are being enforced by payroll. And so when the department tries to put something in that's going to exceed the 480 hours, we're basically pushing back now and paying people out cash, basically at the overtime rate. So we're not allowing them to exceed that federal maximum of 480 hours. Also, I know that we didn't focus on non-safety, but I did have the bullet point in here that with the non-safety groups, they actually have their comp time cashed out under their contract annually. So they can carry 100 hours, they can earn up to 100 hours during the fiscal year, but by the end of the fiscal year, that does get cashed out. So they don't get to keep it and roll it over from fiscal year to fiscal year. So the cost is definitely much smaller because as people take merit increases or potentially promote, they're not carrying those hours forward. And that's probably something we're going to need to look at for public safety.
Makes sense.
Mayor, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Committee
with respect to terminology, and so that we have people that are watching this when it comes to council and possibly right now, when we're using the term compensatory and comp, are they interchangeable?
Yes, they are. My apologies. I should have noted that.
Yeah, and the next, when we make this to the city, please do that. And the second thing, my understanding is, Mr. Nagu, that the issues about the carrying the numbers of hours over were because past human resources prior to you were not bringing this to the attention of the council?
I don't have all the history on that as to why that was occurring, but like I said, I do know that it was negotiated back in, when City Manager Nyhoff came here and they addressed that issue.
I do recall, and it was extremely contentious. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Next slide, please. Thank you. The fifth recommendation deals with internal controls, and as we know, internal controls will be your number one defense against potential fraud. And one of the challenges that we ran across when we started to audit overtime was that we recognized that there wasn't really a centralized payroll department. So the city does have a payroll department, but what we mean by centralized is that there's one body, there's one department that oversees all of payroll and overtime administration. And as we started to dissect the payroll process, we soon recognized that payroll for police was separate, payroll for fire was separate, and payroll for miscellaneous, which is basically all other departments, water, wastewater, recreation, in one group called miscellaneous. So three different types of systems. So that doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that when you have a decentralized system, it presents much more risk. So we are recommending that due to the size and complexity of these payroll, that there should be much more centralized process in place so that one department is actually overseeing all of the payroll within the whole facets of individual departments.
So the
Henry, can we make a request? Just we're having a little bit of connection issues, so if you could just slow down just a little bit so that we can make sure all the sound is coming through properly. Thank you.
Will do.
So on this, the city, we are in agreement, and it's fortuitous. I mean, it's interesting, the recommendation that comes now, because we're right in the process of implementing the ExecuTime payroll system, which is part of the whole ERP system that the city is going to. And with ExecuTime, it will actually centralize this data coming in into the payroll department, where, as Henry said, it's very diffuse right now. You know, different departments are handling timesheets, things of that nature. With this now being electronic, employees will be basically inputting their time electronically. It'll be, you know, go through a predetermined approval process, and then ultimately come to payroll for the final review and upload to be done. So this is supposed to be something we're implementing in a couple more months, a few months out, but that will do the job under this recommendation. Next slide.
Next slide. Okay, this is recommendation number 6, and it's the development of an overtime monitoring system. When you take a look at the overtime usage at the city, it's pretty significant. And what we did not see was a comprehensive monitoring of overtime. So as I mentioned earlier in the prior recommendation, each department, fire, police, and miscellaneous, kind of monitors their own, but there's no centralized system or centralized individual that monitors all of the overtime usage within the various departments. So here the recommendation is to create or use a system-generated feature that would allow someone or some software feature to monitor and evaluate the overtime usage. So something that we could practically see would be like you set metrics. If your ERP is sophisticated enough, you can put metrics where if some department exceeds a certain overtime threshold, it automatically flags that department for further review. And then that would allow somebody to work with the individual departments to identify why there's such a high overtime usage. So really here is developing a mechanism to track and monitor the use of overtime. You want to be proactive in the process to identify the issue rather than so it's great that you have a mechanism to say that, oh, this past year we spent 15% more overtime than the previous year. That's being reactive. You want to be proactive in that process. And this recommendation will allow you to develop a system to monitor the use of overtime as it is being conducted.
And this is something when I was putting together this response, I was speaking with some of the departments that were implementing. And again, I'm going to sound like a broken record with the ERP system. But this is one of those features that the new ERP system will offer, is our ability to much more closely track overtime as it's happening and to really be able to drill down and see exactly where it's happening, even down to more easily down to that individual level, which is what we would like to see and I think is in line with what the recommendation is here. Right now, it's a little more difficult with our current system, as everybody knows, to be able to pull live data and to really get a good handle on what's happening in real time. Oftentimes, we're pay periods behind where we actually are. So again, looking forward, this would be something that we would expect to see as our ERP system is implemented.
Yes, Committee Member Perillo. Committee Member Perillo. So he might
okay,
can't hear me.
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay.
Henry, have you seen in your working history when reviewing other departments, do they list overtime hours by department so that the employees can see who's getting overtime hours? There is a bit of contention that I'm receiving from some employees that certain people are getting all the overtime and others aren't getting an opportunity to get it in various departments, not just one department over the other. Have you ever seen where that information is made available to the employees, say on a monthly sheet or something at the time clock board or however they do it?
That's a great question. From what I gather in speaking with payroll is that the department heads actually do get the report or have the report available to them. But I don't recall an instance where the overtime usage by employee is posted. I don't know if that information, I'm not an HR expert. I'll defer to the city and the Human Resource Department whether that information can be shared in that manner. But it's my understanding that it's probably not. But from what I can recall from speaking with the payroll department, the reports are shared with the department heads.
Okay, well, thank you. Because if it is legal, I definitely think it would be beneficial to all the employees. Stops a degree of selfishness, a perceived perception of selfishness of somebody grabbing all the overtime and others not getting an opportunity to get it spread fairly among the workforce. So my comments. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please. this is our last recommendation, and it all goes back to the centralized system and internal controls. When we started to audit the payroll records, we noticed that the fire department was not maintaining the timesheets in accordance with city policy. It was at a much shorter timeline. So as we started to test timesheets, that information was unavailable. And when we go talk to the payroll department, they're like, each of the public safety departments maintain their own timesheets and documentation, so they didn't have that. It's available to them, but it's not retained by a centralized department. So here we're recommending that there be a more centralized payroll system to ensure compliance with the city's document retention policy. So essentially, each department should adhere to the document retention policy related to payroll and timesheets. And again, as a result of our audit, we noted that the fire department specifically had a much shorter timeline for document retention. So we're saying make that much more consistent with city policy.
Yeah, and so we've so obviously fire has been apprised of that, so they're following the city's retention policy. But again, going back to the executive product I was speaking of earlier, with all of our records that are now going to be electronically held, that system will address this issue on a long-term basis and systemically throughout the entire city. I think next slide, which is just next steps. So once the report is recommended for approval by the Finance and Governance Committee, the combined audit report and the city's responses will be presented to the council in a future meeting. Just kind of wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page with where we were headed with this. And the last slide is questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Committee Member Perillo was able to ask questions after each item, so I'm going to start with Committee Member Lopez, and then Councilman Perillo, I would ask, I would also give you an opportunity if we could kind of wrap it up, just because we have the general fund presentation, yep. And so why don't we go forward? Committee Member Lopez.
Yes, thank you. I think, thank you for the presentation and, providing both sides and how the city can move forward on these recommendations. I think these are all good steps in moving forward, and especially with the implementation of the ERP system that is going to help facilitate all of this. So I definitely, would move this to be recommended to the entire City Council, and as was suggested by Member Perillo, to include some of that background information on the numbers in overtime and what we received previously in the previous committee meeting that gave us a background to all of these recommendations would be helpful for the entire City Council to understand, where this is coming from. And also, I think Member Perillo made a comment about this, that there's definitely misconceptions about how overtime and is used and how it's designated. So I think as much information that can be provided for our public to get a better understanding of how it has worked and how we're moving forward on this would be helpful. So I don't really have any questions, but just wanted to make those comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Committee Member Perillo.
If Mr. Lopez has made that as a motion, I will second that to move this forward to the council. Number one, I want to thank the auditors for doing this. This was a big issue for me particularly, to find out, to get to the bottom of it, and to share with the council members and the public watching. Even last night, I had a longtime resident of the city of Oxnard calling me up complaining about overtime, and this type of report will be very beneficial if the public pays attention. I was able to get him this morning, and he is watching it now. I hope you're paying attention. The presentation, thank you very much. And please, when you talk about the types, comp time, compensation, or comp, please, if there's different acronyms being used, cover them all. Kill as many birds with one stone as you can, because people will still be confused because not everybody is on the same page. Thank you for your work, Henry.
Will do. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I just have a few comments to make. The very first thing is to contextualize this presentation by Henry to the viewing audience, and that is that the City Council has opted not to choose an elected auditor. We have chosen not to have an elected auditor of the city's finances. Instead, we have a private or an auditor that is not elected, that is selected by the city council, that is an independent auditor that looks into specific issues. So that's the first thing, and I hope at some point it puts that issue to rest about whether or not we need an auditor that's elected and independent completely, not only of the city manager, but independent of the city council. I think that's the real problem, is when you have someone that acts in a way that is even above the legislative authority. And so I have a problem with that. I'll just state that. So the very first thing I'd like to say is, and I'm going to time myself here, is that I believe that the number one issue that undermines the public's trust in public employees is excessive amounts of overtime being given to one or two or three different people. So I think the auditor's recommendation about having an overall monitoring system is extremely important. But most importantly, and I'd like to say this to the city manager directly, this might be politically unpopular for some bargaining units. This might be something that is maybe not standard across the line, but somebody at some point needs to draw a line in the sand and say, once you've exceeded a certain amount of hours of overtime, you're not going to get more hours. And I know the arguments against that. It is somebody might offer a specialized service, and that service and whatever it is they're able to offer, or maybe they're the only one left. Everybody else, I don't know. Nobody's available, whatever the explanations are. The fact of the matter is, when one person appears, or two or three people appear on Transparent California as having a $400,000 salary or a compensation because of overtime, it absolutely obliterates the public service element of everyone that's in public service. Fire, police, public works, it doesn't matter what the position is. This has nothing to do with one specific area. It undermines the value of a public servant. And I believe that this city needs a policy on restricting overtime reasonably so that we don't have this kind of thing. And I'll ask my fellow committee members, to weigh in on this. The fact of the matter is that each and every year we have situations where someone who might make $125,000 a year has made more money than the city manager or any top employee of the city. Is that sustainable? Is that sending the right message to the public? I won't answer that question. I think I've already made the argument. So the next thing I want to talk about, and I'd like to ask the auditor about this, and that is replacing someone, and also Mr. Nouveau, is replacing someone who is qualified for an overtime position. I guess and I don't know enough about HR to really understand this, but we wouldn't want a situation where, because you're senior and you're along the line of higher paid and more experienced employees or seasoned employees, that you would be deprived of overtime. I don't think that's just. Yet on the other hand, what I think is very important is that there's some function of an overtime employee, that there's some maybe fairer distribution of who gets overtime, and that gets to the issue of transparency. Committee member Perello asked this. He said, can everyone see who's getting the overtime? And maybe that's, Committee member Perello, that might be an excellent idea. It should be transparent, shouldn't it? It shouldn't be an arrangement. It should be very clear to everyone how you get overtime. I'm not saying it's not, because I quite frankly really don't know, but I think it should be very transparent. Mr. Nouveau, how do we work through that?
So in some departments, they actually have sign-up lists where employees will sign up for overtime. Some departments, they run overtime. It is by seniority, but they start basically, when they initially set up the seniority list, it's done by the most senior person at the top, and then they rotate down through the list until they get down to the bottom, thereby making it so more equitable so everybody gets a shot at overtime. In the police, for police and fire, I think it's more operationally, and probably the chiefs would need to comment on specifically how they offer their overtime shifts.
Okay, and Henry, I'd like to ask you a question.
Sure.
You work with a lot of different cities. Do cities have overtime caps, just like you were talking about the 480-hour limit on comp time? You were talking about that. Mr. DeVoe said we actually, in fact, have that. I think I heard him say. Do cities actually have policies on limiting the maximum amount of overtime hours any employee in their city can work?
Actually, we have not seen that. We do work with quite a number of cities, smaller cities, but in all of those instances, there's really no cap in terms of how much overtime an employee can work. So the concern really is more with public safety, the health and security of that employee, right? If they're working a tremendous amount of hours, ability to function at a very high level, that kind of goes into play with everything as well. But to answer your question directly, no, we don't know of any rule that requires that type of cap for overtime.
Okay. Well, I think this is important, committee members, Mr. City Manager, and to staff. I really think this is important, and I know there's going to be all kinds of reasons why we haven't done it in the past, but when we look at the opportunity cost, I think to me it should be very abundantly clear. I'm going to end. I have a number of things I can say, but I'm going to end and say it should be abundantly clear to us that when we look at the opportunity cost, that the cost of not having a cap far exceeds the opportunity. So that's my personal view as the chair of this committee. So I'll end that and just ask either the city manager, Mr. DeVoe, or any of the other staff members to comment. Maybe I'll start with the city manager.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
We'll have both of our chiefs available when this comes to council.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor, I'd like to make a comment.
Committee member Perello.
Yes, I agree with you. This needs to be addressed by the council, but I want to make a statement so that the public understands. There have been no instances that I'm aware of where individuals working for the city of Oxnard that have gotten overtime have defrauded the city. Not an instance that I'm aware of. If there are, they should be pursued to the fullest extent of the law. But my concern is, and it has been raised in the past, and a former police chief, Williams, addressed the issue. She was going to look at, I think it was Santa Monica. Are there any claims filed against the city of Oxnard involving individuals working for the city, police, fire, trash, whatever, where these people have been working excessive amounts of hours, either at their request or at forced hours, and then there has been an incident based on the people not having enough time off, enough rest? I do understand the very specific. Just for example, if we have somebody that's a specialist in blood technology and there's only one guy, you got to bring him in. But if this cross training and stuff, and you're absolutely 100% right, Mayor, the electeds get eaten alive on Transparent California, and the public has every right to do that. But the people that are making those salaries, to the best of my knowledge, have never been caught doing something illegal where they were not entitled to receive what they get. And I grew up with a phrase, you work, you get paid. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you for letting me say that, Mayor.
Thank you very much. And I just will make sure that I'm not in any way misunderstood. Never have I alleged that anyone that works a lot of overtime is engaged in any kind of fraudulent activity. And I think that overtime says a lot about the employee's dedication, the employee's willingness actually to work harder. So there's a real value to overtime. There's a real necessity of overtime, and I'm glad that the city said that the responses would be coming from fire and police about that. But it's not exclusive to fire and police. It could be, in some instances, it might be rare, but it could be other departments. So thank you very much.
We had a motion by Via and Bini, and I seconded it.
Okay, Madam City Clerk, we did have a motion by Committee Member Lopez and a second by Committee Member Perello. The vote, please, to refer it to the City Council.
Member Lopez?
Yes.
Member Perello?
Yes.
Chair Flynn?
Aye.
The motion carries 3-0.
Thank you very much. And now we'll go on to the next issue, and arguably the most important, and that is item 2, and that is the 2020-2021 general fund balance budget preview. And the recommendation is that the Finance and Governance Committee receive and file a preview of the fiscal year 2020 to 2021 general fund proposed budget and provide feedback. Mr. Riper, I believe.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. I will start with the big picture for the general fund revenue, expenditure, and operating deficit outlook for this year and next. I'll conclude with a comment about $3.25 million of proposed budget reductions by the Big Four operating departments is likely to be recommended by the city manager in his proposed budget in a couple weeks for 2021. And then first, Budget Manager Beth Vo, and then Chief Bass, and then Chief Whitney will describe in some detail those major budget cuts. So, the big picture. Before the recession, we were projecting a $2 million operating deficit in the general fund this year. Now, in the midst of the recession, we're estimating an $11 million operating deficit this fiscal year because of a loss of almost $9 million of general fund revenue. Before the recession, we were projecting a status quo budget for fiscal year 2021. And now we're looking at another $9 million operating deficit next fiscal year if there were no budget reductions made. Again, the result of $9 million of anticipated lost revenue from sales tax and transient occupancy tax and business tax for next fiscal year. Because the operating departments at the city manager's direction have come up with $3.5 million of reductions, the general fund operating deficit for next fiscal year, that's likely to be recommended in a couple of months, will be only $5.3 million. That will leave general fund reserves, if the forecast comes true, at 2.5% of total expenditures plus transfers out at June 30th of 2021, way below your policy goal of 12%. But the city manager and I are resolute in our belief that this is the time in the middle of a recession when you use your reserves. That's what they were put in place for. So that's the big picture, and now I'm going to turn it over to Budget Manager Beth Vo to talk about the first handful of proposed general fund budget reductions totaling $3.25 million for next fiscal year. Beth? Beth, are you unmuted and are you speaking?
Beth, you're on mute.
There she goes.
Hello. Sorry.
Good morning, Beth.
I apologize. Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Flynn, Member Lopez, and Member Perello. I'm going to walk through all of the changes that the department has submitted that are greater than $100,000. I'll start out with the City Clerk Department. In the City Clerk Department, they identify actually a County of Ventura election cost for the November 2020 election. That amount is approximately $112,000. So the net changes there for the City Clerk Department is actually an increase that the department would need to carry out the elections for the November. The next changes is the Community Development Department. The department actually identified the changes in two areas of both revenue and expenditures. On the revenue side, the department identified some one-time increases in total revenue in terms of development in building permits fee, as well as some building receipts for the Sakioga farms that we have. It's approximately $300,000 in net changes. Along with that, the departments also identify a decrease of activities overall in fees and charges, as well as plan check engineering, cannabis fees, and zoning fees. That's approximately total revenue reductions of about $448,000. Along with that, they've also identified about a $50,000 reduction in code compliance administrative fees. So netting all of those changes out, that will amount to about $193,000 of revenue reductions for community development in the upcoming fiscal year. For the expenditure side, the department actually went through and identified 7 vacant positions. Those positions are vacant at the moment. And they went through a process of also prioritization of those positions. They recognize that there will be some reductions in activities in the upcoming year. So based on that, they would forego the hiring of those 7 positions just for the next fiscal year. That resulted in about $744,000 of savings to the general fund. Along with that, they've also identified minor reductions in overtime and temporary labor, about $17,000. Because of the freezing of some of those positions, they would need to have more activities on the contract side. They are asking a net overall increase of about $120,000 in the various line items for contract work, as well as building plan check review, document imaging review, and architectural and landscape coordinations review. So if you net out the two amount of slight increase with a pretty significant savings in freezing of those 7 positions, the net reductions for the expenditure side for community development is about $578,000. Netting the two changes between revenue reductions and decrease of expenditures of $578,000, the net delta changes for community development will be about $384,000 total. So unless you have any questions for me, I will turn it over to Chief Bays to go over the changes for fire.
Thank you very much. And I just would say to the committee members, if we could try to get through the whole presentation and then make our comments at the end. Please. Chief?
Okay, good morning. Thank you. So the last time I was in this position of requested budget reductions to the fire department, one thing we looked at doing was browning out one of our engines. But because a majority of my vacancies exist at the firefighter rank, 14 of them to be exact, I'm proposing this time to reassign my firefighters that are on the existing squad. That's 6 of them to fill those vacancies. So 6 of them will be reassigned onto engine companies, and that's looking at a savings of $876,000 for a fiscal year. I am speaking. Okay. So the squad itself primarily focuses on higher acuity calls, EMS calls in nature. So the paramedics would still function, but only on an engine company. The difference is now where the squad went from EMS call to EMS call, now they're going to be on a multi-purpose vehicle, which is the fire engine. So the fire engine could be committed to everything, including EMS calls, which are about 72% of them. But there's also a possibility that that paramedic, if it's covering the south end of town, will be tied up on another assignment. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
And Chair Flynn, this is Kevin again. On the slide, the chief just covered the $876,000 of savings in overtime from the fire department's proposal to redeploy the paramedic squad. But the next slide, the next bullet on that slide shows an increase of $1 million for station coverage and overtime that's required for minimum staffing. You may remember that in the February presentation I gave to the Finance and Governance Committee, and then again in March to the full council, the Finance Department, the Fire Department projected that the Fire Department was going to overspend its fiscal year 1920 adopted budget appropriation by a little over $2 million because of overtime and station coverage. And on the previous item just today, you heard for the second time results of the overtime audit from Price Page, the internal auditor. Results of that overtime audit showed that fire department overtime is not out of line with other departments or best practices, indicating that the 1920 adopted budget was a little shy, a little low in appropriating enough money for station coverage and overtime. So we are proposing to put $1 million of general fund money into the fire department for next fiscal year to account for minimum staffing and overtime requirements. So you take the $1 million that we are proposing to add to the fire department budget next fiscal year, subtract the $876,000 proposed for redeployment of the paramedic squad, you get a net increase of plus $124,000 to general fund expenditures for the fire department. Next up is Chief Whitney to talk about police department proposed expenditure reductions and changes in revenue for the general fund. Chief?
Good morning, committee members. I'm going to speak up here. If I'm talking too loud, please let me know. Within the police department, we've been making cuts at least for the last 10 years. And what that means is we're to the point where if you're going to make any cuts of substance, you end up having to cut personnel. So our proposal is to eliminate 17 positions within the police department. 11 of them are sworn positions, and 6 of them are civilian positions. As you know, we have 249 sworn officers. I've explained recently that we have, of those, we have 28 vacancies, and that's a high number for us. In all practical terms, there's no way that we would be able to fill 28 vacancies in the upcoming fiscal year anyways. So our proposal for this upcoming budget is that we eliminate 10 of those 28 vacancies. We also have had a long-term contract with several of the school districts, but the Oxnard Elementary School District informed us because of their own budget cuts, they're not going to be able to continue with our contract that we have. And that contract is about $400,000, excuse me, and it pays for 3 school resource officers. So that'll be $400,000 less in revenue that the city is going to get. Because of that, and in trying to find opportunities to make cuts, we have a full-time sergeant right now that supervises 8 school resource officers. Since we're going to be losing 3 of them, those 5 officers, we're proposing to now have them supervised by a patrol sergeant that does it on a collateral basis. So it's not the only thing that sergeant's doing, but it will save us some money. So we're proposing to eliminate that 1 sergeant position. The other cuts, there are 6 civilian positions that we are proposing to cut. Unfortunately, partly with HR restrictions that we have to follow, we have not been able to talk to those 6 employees. I'm sorry, the affected employees, so I can't go into detail on those, but 3 of them are vacant positions, 3 of them are filled positions. The filled positions, there are vacancies within the police department, so they will be offered opportunities to go to other vacant positions. So nobody is necessarily going to be laid off with these proposals. So that's my part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. This is Beth again. I'll go through the next biggest changes, which is public works. Within general fund, public work has several divisions, but the biggest one that are being proposed with reductions here is the public work construction and design division. The department actually identified a total of about 9 positions
Member Perello, the number underneath the Network 5 is $0.9 million.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate your work. Thank you.
And that's a good lead-in for me to give my usual caveat to the Finance and Governance Committee, which is the numbers can change. We're in the middle of a very uncertain recession. The revenue outlook is very tough to predict. We gave you the 50% confidence level revenue estimates in our general fund revenue projections for this year and next. With 50% confidence level does not mean we are 50% confidence the forecast is accurate. Rather, it means there's a 50% chance the forecast will prove too low and a 50% chance the forecast will prove too high. In other words, it's a middle of the road best estimate of where we think revenue will end up this fiscal year and next. And that concludes our presentation, Chair.
Thank you very much. And now we'll go to the committee members. Why don't we start with committee member Lopez, please?
Great, thank you. So in this presentation, we're seeing the proposed based on the department. So I'm wondering if we can get a full picture of where we do expect any revenue coming in, and how the borrowing of the enterprise funds looks like on the budget. But more generally, the question that I have is, what will this budget look like in impacts on residents? What will this look like to the community? And using the example from last year of seeing certain services being cut, and how our residents saw that with reduced service out in the streets and that sort of thing. So what will this year's budget look like to the public?
Mr. Mayor, I'm going to try to answer that question. So what's difficult is, as Mr. Riper mentioned, it's hard to fully predict what's going to happen with this economy. Now, what we're doing with this budget is we're utilizing our reserves, which again is this is the absolute appropriate moment to utilize an organization's reserves. So we believe we can hold steady, but it could all change within the first half year, within the first 6 months of this new budget. So if we can hold steady here, aside from the reduction in services that the fire chief described, everything can hold steady. Now, but as a unnecessary reminder, probably, things aren't very good as they are. Right, our median strips look bad, our streets are in bad shape, our parks aren't being taken care of as frequently as we want. I mean, we're already at minimum services as it is. So what we're trying to do here is not to let it slip any worse for now. But this could all change by the end of the calendar year, halfway into the next fiscal year, depending again on what happens with the economy. Now, you also questioned borrowing the cash from the enterprise funds. So if the council approves that, then what it means is it's simply a cash flow issue for us. Anything we borrow from the enterprise funds is not revenue and can't go towards any appropriations. It's really for cash flow, primarily because of the delay or the deferral of sales tax payments that the governor has provided for businesses. So we just may not be getting whatever's left of sales tax during this pandemic. We just may not get the payments on time. So that's all that is for. I hope that answers the questions for now.
Yeah, so thank you. And just to clarify, in terms of, what the community will see, after June 30th, is that we won't see an increase in the medians being taken care of, that sort of thing. So there won't be any further impact. It'll just be prolonged with the service that we will see in the city.
That is what we're hoping for.
Thank you. That's all on my end.
Thank you very much. Committee Member Perello.
Thank you for the information, gentlemen. It's still not good. It could be a lot worse. It definitely could be a lot better. I appreciate giving us the update. I appreciate the truthful honesty you're doing. I also appreciate the concept of driving the middle of the road. The 50%, I'd rather be a little bit over or a little bit under, not a whole lot over or a whole lot under. So I appreciate Mr. Riper bringing this to our attention and the city manager agreeing with him, or vice versa, however, who's taking the credit. But it's to the benefit of our residents. I'd like the public to understand this. There are people that are now getting the idea, oh, we got $30 million we just found because we're going to borrow $10 million from enterprise funds. And I'm being asked specifically, which enterprise fund are you going to borrow from first? And specifically, well, then why can't we hire more people and not have to make all these cuts? I'd like an explanation for the public and this council member, the difference between a direct loan, going out for a bond, and a line of credit from internally. I do understand that the city treasurer has also agreed with the borrowing internally would be better for the city in the long run, but those are some of my questions because the public may be thinking, wait a minute, we can't be hurting that much. And again, come back to the phone call that I got last night. You have all this money. How could you be saying you're hurting that much? We got all this money. We have all this money. So those are my only comments. Again, I appreciate this. And I want to thank the change along the line of, making a PowerPoint to where we're going. Because gentlemen and ladies, just imagine you're at home sitting on your sofa having a cup of coffee. You just had a pretty good dinner with the wife and the kids and things are okay. And now the guy's talking about, oh my God, the budget. And it's like, honey, come here and watch this. If you don't know exactly what you're talking about on which column, you get lost real easy, and you'll end up thinking those knuckleheads in downtown are going to shaft us again. And I don't believe the knuckleheads in downtown are trying to shaft the residents. I want the residents to be on the same boat, the same ticket, and the same knowledge of where we're going and how rough those seas are going to be. Thank you very much, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Mr. Riper, I hope that under no circumstances...
Can't hear you, Tim.
Oh. Can anyone hear me?
Now I can.
Okay, very good. Okay. Mr. Riper, I just hope that under no circumstances that anyone in the community thinks, because the city has authorized, or the city council has authorized up to $30 million to be borrowed from 3 different enterprise funds for cash flow issues. So because the receipt of revenue from the state is delayed because of the COVID-19 crisis, we don't have a lot of money. If we borrow money from the enterprise fund, it's only to meet our payment obligations until we get the payments from the state. Could you clarify that and make sure once and for all that nobody anywhere here in the city of Oxnard thinks that we have an excess of cash that we're not using?
Mayor, you stated it accurately. The potential borrowing from the enterprise funds is only a balance sheet transaction for cash flow purposes to keep the general fund cash from going negative while sales tax cash doesn't come in from the state due to the governor's deferral. There is no budget appropriation request accompanying the authorization for a loan. The authorization for a loan does not affect the fiscal year 2021 budget. It's just to keep cash in the general fund at 0 or slightly positive. There's no new spending or authorization by the City Council as a result of the cash flow borrowing concept that will be considered by City Council shortly. You said it correctly.
Committee Member Perillo, does that address your concern?
Yes, because Mayor, the underlying nasty comments from last night, I think were, well, you guys raised the utility rates for a tremendous amount so you could have all this money that you could have in a slush fund. That is not what we did. That is not what this council's actions have created. And I appreciate Mr. Riper explaining that. That's what I want to make sure my management and my council understand. We've got people that are asking those questions.
Thank you very much. I'll just conclude by saying people should be asking those questions, and we should be providing the answers that we're providing here publicly during this committee meeting. So I think it's healthy that people are asking questions and continue to do so. Another thing that I think is clear that we make, or abundantly clear to the public, recently the city treasurer gave a presentation, his quarterly report on the city's cash that he is in charge of, right? And investing that cash. And it's close to $250 million. And I mean, if I'm a member of the public and I'm watching that presentation and I'm hearing either in the paper or by watching council meetings that the city has these real formidable budget challenges, but then I hear from the city treasurer that there's close to $1 billion, $250 million. Let me clarify, $250 million that's being invested of public money, the public's money. Then I'm going to ask the question, well, wait a minute, what do you mean the city has a financial problem? There's close to $250 million, $1 billion in assets. I'm sorry, for some reason I'm getting that wrong this morning. The fact of the matter is that cash is restricted. It cannot be used for the general fund. So I think it's very important that we talk about that. And so I'll make a final statement. I was aware of this presentation prior to the presentation. It was I went over the department heads and the city manager and over this with me thoroughly. I understand it. I appreciate the hard work that's gone into it, and I'm hoping that the budget gap of 5.5, whatever it is, can be closed with the negotiations that the city manager has entered with various bargaining units of the city of Oxnard. So that's it. And I do know, I believe, Madam City Clerk, we do have one speaker, and that's Jim Lavery. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, while she's ringing Mr. Lavery, she's ringing Mr. Lavery, so I'll make a comment after Mr. Lavery speaks, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Hello?
Hi, Jim. You've got 3 minutes. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks. Good discussion by the committee members and good questions. A couple of things I want to know. One, are we getting a sales tax increase or not? So it needs to be in the report. It should have been in the report 2 weeks ago when the chief financial officer gave his overall summary. It was obvious to me that there was no documentation that said how the city could make up the revenue losses as a result of the COVID virus. So it seemed to me that there was going to have to be some sort of tax increase, but it wasn't in the report. And that's unfair to the Republic, and that's distrust what the city's doing. Now I'm going to move over to today. In the background section, it says the budget operating deficit is $10.8 million. We need to know where that number came from. What is the documentation of that number? This is the committee level. You need to know, you need to be asking these questions. That's what a committee is for, to dig into the details. And don't take things on blind faith, because yes, this is an overview, this is a big picture, a summary, but this is the time to get into the details before the public gets it. The more details you expose, the more faith you're going to have in the end result. Another thing I want to say is about Measure O. Measure O should be considered right alongside the general fund. The two, they're basically one and the same. So if you're funding things, Measure O, that you're not disclosing here, that's dishonest. Now, last year, Measure Station number 4 was funded out of Measure O. Now, is that happening again this year? If so, you need to disclose that. That's one reason why the details are important. And another thing I want to say is about getting the details from staff. If I'm just saying that this is not a dig, this is a fact, that in last February's report, they admitted they underestimated fund balance, year-end fund balance by $4.8 million. So that tells me that you as a committee and the council as a whole has to ask for more questions, has to ask for the details, because that $4.8 million could have saved people's jobs. It could have not led to the discussion about closing fire station number 4 in the first place. You never know. So that's why, and it's the old trust but verify maxim. Now, the last city manager, I know a couple of the council members would have been all over them for not providing in detail for what they. Let's do the same here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there were there were Mr. Riper and Mr. Nguyen. There were some times where I couldn't hear everything that Mr. Lavery said because of the interference with the phone call. But I'll start actually with the city manager. Mr. City Manager.
Actually, Chair Flynn, this is Kevin. I'll take the questions. Mr. Lavery asked for the details. There's a reason that this item is called preview of the general fund budget. Mr. Lavery, from his own experience as a municipal finance officer, is accustomed to the public asking for the budget before the budget is ready. The budget will be ready next month, as we've been saying for months. This is just a preview. The budget that is published will have the details that Mr. Lavery craves. Second, Mr. Lavery asked how much Measure O funding is going into this general fund budget. The answer is none. If we listed today all of the things that are not going into this general fund budget, we'd be here for another hour. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Mr. City Manager.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And then to the point about the sales tax, I am discussing it openly. The reason it's not on here yet is because it's not up to us, right? That's something that eventually would have to go before the voters if I can convince the council to put it on the ballot, and we're not there yet. So that's why we're not going to build potential sales tax revenue into a budget when we don't even have the sales tax authorized by the voters. So Mr. Lavery is several steps ahead of us on that one. A final comment I need to make is to be sure that we have enough awareness and honesty about this entire situation. We cannot look at the picture right now in a vacuum. This is not a snapshot of the city of Oxnard in this pandemic. There's more to it than this. So while this pandemic and the ensuing recession is wreaking havoc on most cities in California, there are a handful of cities that are going to survive this relatively well because they are healthy, high-functioning organizations. The recent history here has led us to this place where we're unprepared. You've heard me say this before. As a city, it's like we had underlying conditions prior to this pandemic. So we come into this with an extremely anemic reserve. We didn't come into this with a healthy fat reserve, and that is part of our challenge. So I want to be clear to everyone, we've been upside down in terms of revenue and expenses for a long time. There's a lot of critique about on the expense side, but this council and this city, there's documented history of cutting and cutting and cutting and shaving and shaving and shaving. So we're down to the point where we have to face the reality that if we don't right-size and balance our revenue and our expenditures to provide the level of services that everyone demands, it's never going to get better. But again, let's look at the big picture here and not operate in a vacuum of solely this pandemic, right? Our ability to respond and recover to this pandemic was premised on how our health coming into it, not during it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. City Manager. And just because of the time here, of course, the Public Works Committee is due to begin at 11 o'clock, and it's just a minute after 11. One of the things, committee members, that this recommendation asks us for is to provide feedback. Well, we've definitely provided some feedback. I want to say, as chairman of the committee, that we have an anticipated budget gap for next year of just about $5.5 million. And I know that the city manager is working on narrowing that gap. I want to make clear as the chairman here that there is, I mean, no matter what the city manager does and the staff does to try to narrow that gap, we cannot leave the general fund exposed and in jeopardy with a $1 or $2 or $2.5 million balance. I just want to, I'm emphatic about saying to the council when this comes to us that if in fact we're not just having problems narrowing that 5.5 deficit for next fiscal year, but but it's just not looking like it's working. I think, you know, we're going to have to make further cuts. I don't want to see any further borrowing and the draining of this general fund reserve. That's my bottom line message. That the city manager is right. He's right on that we have shaved and we have cut to the point where service levels are already low. But I see, and again, an opportunity cost or a benefit cost, that if we lower that general fund reserve down to just a couple $1 million, when our own policy says that we're going to have 12% in the fund, and again, that COVID-19 has really thrown us off base, but I think we need to react accordingly, and I think we need Mr. City Manager more cuts and not to borrow from the general fund reserve if we can't meet that $5.5 million deficit. Those are my final comments. And with that being said, any future agenda items that committee members would like brought forward?
Yes. If Vianney has it, I'll go for Vianney first.
Go ahead, committee member. Go ahead, committee member Lopez.
Thank you. I just had a question. So this is the first preview we have. Will we get any updates at our next committee meeting before it goes to before it's presented to council regarding the budget?
Unfortunately not, council member. Given our timing and our constraints, we're going to go to the council on June 16th. But the budget document would be published 12 days before. I'm sorry, not 12 days, June 10th. The budget document will be published June 10th.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Committee member Pro.
That was a very good question, Councilman Lopez. There are two things that I'd like to see this committee consider. Number one, if we get another item on the agenda for our city council meetings, that if anybody has had any ex parte communications, that there be one item on the agenda where we are at that. Copy somebody who's successful. Copy the Planning Commission. They have that on their agenda. I do think also, since the second person that this council hires, the city attorney, there should be an opportunity where the city attorney, if he's got a comment, just like our city manager has an opportunity, the city attorney could make a comment about something we need to know. And those are my two concerns. On a final note, with the comments that have been made, the comment that the city manager made about the city of Oxnard and the condition that it was in trying to come out of in this pandemic, this is the equivalent, in my mind, very simple, plain English. Whether mama or daddy spends all the money on beer or lottery tickets and expect everything to be okay, and something goes wrong, they have themselves to look in the mirror. The city of Oxnard has itself to look in the mirror and things that has been done in the past. The current council and management is doing their damnedest to bring the city up and out of the mess that they're in right now. And I want to thank the people that are working for the city of Oxnard for doing the job that they're doing, and my fellow council members for taking the heat for doing what they're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with no further items, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.